Yeah, we have our lectureship coming up, and Sunday is what is known as Easter Sunday. And there's a lot of events where denominations will go together and to try to put off some big thing for the area. And they have in times asked me as a preacher of the gospel here and there, different places here in Oklahoma, would contact me to see if we wanted to participate. That and rally around the flag post and National Prayer Day and all these kind of things, which I assure you, I really appreciate what these people are striving to do in all goodness. But I want to present some things which surely are not new to us about why I do not fellowship denominations, why I do not partake in their efforts, although indeed they be good efforts, and although they think I'm mighty strange not to want to work with them in these efforts, or that I'm mighty really off because I don't want to join the ministerial alliance, which is all the pastors getting together. I don't know how often they do that to work together in various forms. But I came out of religious confusion. I was brought up in the Lord's church, and I learned that I'm not in fellowship with denominations. And the reasons are reasons that are biblical, and it's not reasons because of, my church is better than your church, kind of like, rival football game teams and so forth. And when I say that, it's not because I don't love the people. And it's not because, and not that I'm going to be rude to them. Can't do that, not as a Christian. Not that I'm haughty, looking down my nose upon them. That's not it at all. But there are indeed biblical, scriptural reasons why God's people do not fellowship with such. And before I venture into that, let me be very, very quick in this and kind of give a history of what happened. That the Lord established the church, had the apostles be building upon it, and we had the church. Paul and the other apostles went about throughout the world establishing the churches. And when they had an error, they would write the scriptures or give the teachings to correct those things, because there was a truth to adhere. There's a truth to build and stick to. But in time, as the apostles and the inspired men, as they died off, and even before they did, that there were false doctrines and false teachings that continued to be taught. And much of this was not kept in check. Or if it was, it wasn't successfully done. And so the Lord's church began to drift away. It had a lot of the truth, but it began to add false teachings. False teachings, false doctrines, false practices, the false way of being organized. We had an eldership, and we had deacons, and that was it. But they started making one bishop above the elders, to the point that then the eldership was dissolved and just had the bishops. And it continued on like that over the decades and over the centuries. And the distinction became so distinct that it became quite obvious in history that they were no longer the Lord's church. They had just simply changed too much. And in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, they were even warned about making a change, that they needed to repent. And there was one that if they didn't repent, God would remove the candlestick, an identification mark in God's eyes that they were the church. And so the church fell away, and became very, very corrupt. But in the 1500s, there became men like John Calvin and Martin Luther, and we hear these words a lot, that they began to, who were priests in the Catholic Church themselves, But they read their Bible and they looked at what they believed and taught the church did, and they said, we need to make a change here. We need to get back to make some changes. And so they were excommunicated. And the people that they were preaching to, they went with them. And so they formed denominations. And it started off somewhat slow, but now it's just denominations are popping up all over the place. And so what we had for the first 1,400 years, we had Catholicism as it was changing off the Lord's church. There was the Lord's church. We can be assured that the Lord's church continued because Jesus said, as He's going to establish the church, and the gates of Hades, the powers of death, shall not prevail against it. So the Lord's church, even if we don't have any record of the Lord's true church existing, we know by faith, as Marion pointed out this morning, by faith, by the evidence, by the Scriptures, that the Lord's church continued on. And so then we came to all the various denominations. So we are not saying that the Lord's church, of which we are a member, is one of the many different denominations, and we're just holding out, being together with Him in these joint efforts. That's not it at all. We're saying that we are the Lord's church, and we're not saying this with arrogance, and that all else is in spiritual error. So why don't we? Why don't I? And why shouldn't any of us have fellowship with denominational efforts? Now, that's not to say that my uncle comes over and he's a member of the Baptist church that I can't associate with him. It's not talking about that. We're talking about the spiritual fellowship, acceptance one of another in each other's sight. First of all, denominationalism, think about this. If you haven't already, sure you have. Denominationalism makes God out to contradict Himself. Denominationalism, they have gotten to the point. They didn't begin this way. They started their split-offs because they're saying, look, we believe this and you believe that, and we just can't get along together. So we're over here and you're over there. And that's the way it was. But it grew so much and it had been around so long, and they finally recognized the fact, well, if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that's what it takes is faith, and you're saved, and we do, well, I know we have different differences, but we must be all children of God, so we can have fellowship. Go ahead and meet over there. You don't like to do this, we like to do this spiritually, but we don't, we don't meet together. We can work together in some efforts. So they're saying that everybody in basically everybody in denominationalism is okay with God. Yeah, we teach different things, but that's okay with God. That's okay with God. And that's a key factor. And so what we have here is either God is teaching these false doctrines through these different denominations, or at least God's accepting them. Yeah, y'all believe that you need to be baptized by sprinkling. We believe that you need to be baptized by pouring. But it's okay. But can that be the truth? Can God say outside one side of His mouth, you need to be saved by sprinkling, and that is the way? And then also say, you need to be saved by being poured upon, and that is the way. It's got to be one or the other, or maybe a third. It cannot be both. God cannot contradict Himself. For example, Baptists say that they must immerse and not sprinkle, and they're right on that. But there'll be those of the Nazarenes who say, no, you can sprinkle, and there are other groups. I'm just picking one or two out here. So there's a contradiction. There's the Assemblies of God who say, once you're saved, you can so live to be lost. And there'll be others, such as the Presbyterians. Some Presbyterians teach, well, once you're saved, you're always saved. Well, which one is it? It can't be both, because they are contradictions. What about infant baptism? Well, the Baptists say, no, you can't. Infant baptism doesn't do anything. But Catholicism and Methodists and so forth, they say, yes, you can be baptized as an infant. And so, it can't be both. So there's a contradiction that lies in all these hundreds of teachings that denominations have. So to have the idea that everybody's okay and God accepts all these things, that makes God out to be one who believes or teaches or at least approves of contradictions. And so people in the world look at the situation of Christianity, just as a side note, and what are they left to conclude? Well, they conclude rightly. If denominationalism is true, you mean to tell me that you have a God that says you can be saved by sprinkling, and others say, no, you can't, it has to be by pouring? Well, God's just a being of contradictions. But then they go one step further, going, a God does not contradict himself, and so therefore there's no God. No wonder Jesus prayed that they all be one. Why? That the world might believe. And the opposite of that is, when we're not one, what's going to happen? The world's not going to believe. And that's exactly what has happened. So the tremendous danger of affirming contradictions. A contradiction, what is it? Well, it's where two statements both cannot be right. For example, I could say, this is a sheet of paper. And then I could say, or someone else could say, this is not a sheet of paper. Well, it has to be one or the other. But to affirm both is a contradiction. And furthermore, the problem gets even worse because while human beings might make contradictions, they might do that accidentally. Both God doesn't do things by accident. He knows what He says. So if God is going to affirm or to teach doctrine A and also not doctrine A, take whatever doctrine you want, and it's the opposites, yes, no, and God knows which one is right. So when God, through His denomination, is saying doctrine A is what is true, and then when God is approving not doctrine A, and God knows that's false, but He's approving anyway, then that's making God out to be a liar, is it not? But we know in Titus chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, or 2 verse 1, that God does not lie. God does not lie. So I do not have fellowship. We cannot have fellowship with denominationalism because it makes God out to teach, or at least approve contradictions. It makes God out to approve of that which is false. It makes God out to lie because He's proven one that has got to be false. It makes God to have a faulty character, but we know that the God of the Bible does not have faulty characters. If God has a character of telling the truth, then He's perfect in it. If God has the character of not speaking contradictions, and even in our court systems, we know that when a witness speaks a contradiction, something is wrong with his witness. So, I wish that denominations would understand what they're doing to themselves and making God out to be, and what they're doing to, in the broad sense of the term, Christianity, when people are turning away. But there's another reason. There's 5 in all that I have this morning, if we get to them all. And it's found in 2 John verses 9 through 11. I think that's probably a very familiar passage. So I do not have fellowship with denominations, because if I do, I am disobeying these verses. The verses read in 2 John 9 through 11. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. So if somebody goes beyond, transgress, there says to go further than what is right. So there is a right and a wrong. There is a truth and a falsehood. So here he's saying whoever goes beyond, who doesn't have the truth and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, the doctrine of Christ, the teachings of Christ, our New Testament, if somebody comes to you and brings this, the idea of bringing here, as it's pointed out in theirs, means to bring by announcing. So here's one who is promoting something that is not Christ's doctrine. It might sound religiously, it might sound scriptural, but if it's not, then it's not. And so here's one who brings, who's promoting this particular doctrine, going throughout the countryside, preaching this doctrine. If anybody comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him. Now the idea here is to receive with the idea of acceptance and endorsement. So if anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine of Christ, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him. Don't give any kind of impression that you accept and endorse what he's teaching. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. Well, we certainly don't want to be sharing in his evil deeds. So yes, we do not want to be helping those who are teaching that was wrong. So I cannot fellowship a Baptist preacher because if I did, I'd be going beyond, I'd be transgressing, or I'd be helping those who are teaching that, and when they teach faith only. Or the Presbyterian pastors, because they teach infant baptism. I cannot let them think that I approve and accept what they teach. Or the Christian church pastors, because they use mechanical instruments when the scriptures tell us not. Or the Methodist pastor who teaches on sprinkling. Or the Pentecostal pastors, because they will teach on miracles. And the Lutheran pastor, because he teaches on original sin. Or the Roman Catholic priest, because he teaches on the scripturalness of the Pope. So in all these things, I could not take part in the ministerial alliance, could not take part in any kind of Easter put together, and anything else that came up. And likewise, no Christian can do the same. If anyone comes to you and brings not this teaching, then we are not to greet them, we're not to receive them, not to let them think that we approve of what they believe. Also, a third thing, I do not fellowship those in denominationalism spiritually because of a principle that I see in 1 Kings chapter 20. In 1 Kings chapter 20, Israel's king Ahab, he defeated, by the help of God, the Syrian enemy king, Ben-Hadad. And after the battle, Ahab and Israel soundly defeated this Ben-Hadad. And after that, they captured this Ben-Hadad. And Ben-Hadad, he humbled himself and he begged for mercy and so forth. And Ahab accepted him and brought him up into his chariot, a significant manifestation of acceptance. Now, what have we learned in other places, like with Joshua when they defeated the enemy kings? Why, he had them lay down and put his foot upon their neck. You know, they defeated them and killed them. But not so with Ahab. Well, Ahab didn't stand too good with God anyway. So then what we see here in 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 42, here's how God felt about that. Then the prophet said to Ahab, "Thus says the Lord, because you have let slip out of your hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people." So in that principle that we see here is that when there is an enemy, now we're not talking about mortal enemies here upon earth, but we're talking about spiritual enemies, the ultimate enemy being the captain of that group, that being Satan. But the principle here is that God's people were to destroy the enemy that Ahab was up against and not accept him. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, we read this. Verse 1. He says, but there are also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who brought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. So yes, there are false prophets. There are false teachers. There are those who teach that which is not scriptural, and we are not to be in fellowship with them. And fourthly, I do not have fellowship with denominations and their pastors because of how it might influence me. Every pastor that I've known has been a real nice person. They're so good to visit with. They don't use bad language and so forth. And it's so tempting just to buddy up with them. Let's be friends and let's do that and the other together and so forth. But they might influence me. I might let down my guard. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, it says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now, we know what the leaven does. We've made food yesterday, and some use leaven, the yeast, to make the dough rise and so forth. How it affects one thing, one molecule after another. And so spiritually, it's talking that way, that a little leaven, a little budding up with that which is wrong can affect me, can affect us. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, it says, evil companionship corrupts good morals. Now, oftentimes we try to use this with our children and the young people. Evil companionship, you buddy up with those who are out in the world, that they do the things that are wrong and so forth. It can wear off on you, and indeed it can. But it also, that verse applies to us who are adults. It can still yet rub off on us. So I don't fellowship those who are in denominations spiritually. David said in Psalms 106, verse 35, that Israel mingled themselves with the nations and learned their works. Well, not how to build skyscrapers, but their works spiritually, religiously. And what happened to them? They went off into idol worship. So yes, Israel mingled themselves with the nations. Why did God tell Joshua when they crossed the Jordan River to take out all the people? Because he didn't want those people there to influence God's people. And the people weren't all pushed out. They weren't all killed. And we see the history that they were affected. And the same thing will happen to us. In Numbers chapter 16, verse 26, it says, and he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart now from the tents of these wicked men. Depart from the dwelling places of these wicked men. Touch nothing of theirs. Why? Lest you be consumed in all their sins. Just touching it, and all of a sudden we're consumed with the sins? No. But we accept, and we become familiar. And we accept one thing and another and a step after that, and it keeps going until they can take part in all their sins. So yes, we need to be so very, very careful that we do not fellowship those who are in spiritual error. Psalms 119, verse 115 says, depart from me, ye evildoers, for I will keep the commandments of my God. Depart from me, separate yourselves from me, so that I can keep the commandments of my God. And the last reason, I do not have fellowship with denominations because of plain, simple verses which say not to. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, says, have no fellowship. How much? No fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Does he leave it at that? No. He says, but rather reprove them. So no, we don't have fellowship with those who are doing denominational activities and so forth. I don't go to places. About 8 years ago, when I was doing my work on the book that I wrote on Catholicism, I visited a Catholic church to see what was still going on. But I didn't stand up when they stood up. I didn't kneel on those pads when they knelt. I didn't pray with them, but I was just observing what was going on. I knew I was not in spiritual fellowship with them. In Romans chapter 16, verse 17, also tells us that we must not accept those in religious error. We've already looked at 2 John 9 through 11. And 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? It's not as though Paul was asking, I don't know the answer to that question. Could y'all tell me? No, he was teaching by a question. What fellowship does unrighteousness have with righteousness? And the answer is none. There is no fellowship. Yes, we need to make sure that we recognize the fact of what the Scriptures teach us. And we're not trying to be rude. Sometimes they think that we're cults. I've heard that in a couple different places, but we are indeed to love them. We cannot act rude to them. We cannot be snobbish to them. I mean, how are we going to be able to help them to see the truth if they think that we are that kind of way? So the bottom line is, what the Bible tells us is that we cannot have religious fellowship with denominations. And so that's still been a question in your mind, or perhaps maybe needing reinforcement, I hope the things that we've been able to see this afternoon would be most helpful. The invitation song has been selected. We're going to stand and sing the song. And if there's anyone here who needs to become a Christian by your faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, that's God's plan. Not a denominational plan, but what God said. God's going to be the one that's on the judgment seat, not any religious pastor or priest or anything like that. So we need to do what God has to say. So if you have that need, won't you come while together we stand and while we sing.